In a small, quiet cabin deep in the forest lived a man named Elias. The cabin was far from the nearest village, nestled among towering pine trees, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of birds. Elias had chosen this life of solitude many years ago. His life had been filled with sorrow, and the peace of the forest offered him a place to heal. Every morning, Elias would wake up before the sun, the cold winter air biting at his skin as he prepared for another day. The thick walls of the cabin kept the cold at bay, but the fire in the hearth was always the first thing to light. Elias was a woodsman, skilled at chopping timber and gathering firewood. The forest was his home, and he knew it like the back of his hand. The trees, the animals, and even the distant sound of the river, these were his companions. Elias wasn't unhappy. He had learned to live alone after his wife passed away many years before. He had loved her deeply, but she had fallen ill, and nothing could save her. After her death, he couldn't bring himself to stay in the village where everyone knew him as a husband. The memories of his wife haunted him there, so he moved deep into the forest, seeking comfort in the quiet away from the world. Over the years, he had grown used to the stillness. His days were spent in the forest, cutting down trees, building furniture, and maintaining the cabin. The nights were long, and he would sit by the fire with only his thoughts for company. Sometimes he would remember the time when his life was filled with laughter and love. Those memories were bittersweet, but they were fading. He had accepted the loneliness as part of his life. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the tall trees, Elias was finishing his work in the woods. He had spent the whole day cutting firewood for the coming winter, and now, with his arms aching, he was ready to return home. The sky was turning orange, and the cool evening air carried the scent of pine. Elias pulled his coat tightly around him and started the long walk back to his cabin. But as he walked through the trees, something unusual caught his eye. Just ahead, near the edge of his property, he saw a figure. At first, he thought it might be a traveler lost in the woods, but then he saw that it was a woman. She stood there, her face pale and worn, her clothes torn and ragged. She looked as if she had been traveling for days, maybe weeks, without rest. Elias froze. He wasn't used to seeing strangers, let alone a woman and children, in this part of the woods. But as he approached, he saw that she was not alone. She was holding the hands of 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The children looked just as tired and frightened as their mother. The youngest one, a girl, was crying softly. The woman noticed Elias and, with a weak voice, called out to him. "Please, can you help us?" Elias hesitated. His life had been solitary for so long, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared to take on the responsibility of helping strangers. But something in the woman's voice moved him. It was clear they were in need, and Elias had never been the type to turn away someone in need. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the snow beneath him. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice gentle but cautious. The woman explained that her name was Beatrice and that she and her children had been traveling for days after their home had burned down. They had nowhere to go, and Beatrice was desperate to find shelter before the cold winter night set in. She had heard of a cabin deep in the woods and had hoped it was a safe place for them to stay. Elias looked at the children, their faces pale and their clothes dirty from the journey. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes. It was clear that they had been through a lot, and the thought of them being left out in the cold was too much for Elias to ignore. Without saying much, he nodded. "Come with me. You can stay in my cabin for the night." Beatrice let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. Elias nodded, turning and leading them through the trees toward his cabin. The children followed quietly, the youngest still clutching her mother's side. As they walked through the woods, Beatrice looked at Elias and tried to find the right words to express her gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without your kindness. We've been traveling for days, and I was afraid we wouldn't make it." Elias didn't say anything, but the truth was he hadn't expected this. He had been content with his quiet life, and now, suddenly, he was responsible for a woman and her children. He wasn't sure what to make of it. When they reached the cabin, Elias opened the door, and the warmth from the fire inside hit them immediately. The children looked around in wonder at the simple, cozy home. It was small but warm, with a crackling fire in the hearth and a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. Beatrice, still holding her youngest child in her arms, stepped inside, her eyes filled with gratitude. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias nodded and gestured for them to sit by the fire. He went to the stove and poured them each a bowl of stew, offering the children some bread and cheese as well. The children were hesitant at first, but once they tasted the food, they ate hungrily. Elias watched them, feeling a strange mix of discomfort and compassion. The woman, Beatrice, sat down by the fire, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her. She smiled at Elias, her eyes soft with thanks. "You've saved us," she said. "I don't know how to repay you." Elias didn't reply. He wasn't looking for repayment. He had only done what seemed right. But as he watched them, the warmth of the fire reflected in their tired faces, he couldn't help but feel something stirring within him. It had been so long since he had shared his space, his home, with anyone. And yet, as the children's laughter filled the room, he realized that this moment, this unexpected meeting, was the beginning of something new. As the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Elias watched the children, their faces glowing with the soft light of the flames. They were no longer shivering from the cold, and the food he had given them seemed to fill their spirits as much as their stomachs. The eldest boy, Thomas, was the first to speak after a long silence. He was about 12 years old, with messy brown hair and bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity. "Thank you for the food," Thomas said, his voice polite but filled with awe. "We haven't had a meal like this in days." Elias simply nodded, not used to such gratitude, but appreciating it all the same. "You're welcome. It's nothing," he said, trying to downplay his efforts. "Everyone needs a warm meal." The middle child, Emily, was around 10. She was a lively girl with curly hair and a mischievous smile. As she ate, she glanced around the small cabin, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's so cozy in here," she said with a soft laugh. "We've never stayed in a place like this before." "It's nice," Elias smiled faintly. He wasn't much for words, especially with children, but he couldn't help feeling a little pride in what little he had. His cabin, though small, was well kept and had everything he needed to survive in the wilderness. It wasn't much, but it was his home. Lily, the youngest of the three, was still clutching her mother's side. She was a tiny girl, barely 6 years old, with wide, innocent eyes that never seemed to stop looking around. She wasn't used to strangers, and her shyness showed in the way she stayed close to her mother, barely touching her food. Beatrice, the mother, was sitting quietly beside the fire, her eyes on her children, watching them eat. She was a woman in her early 30s, with a gentle face and a quiet strength that Elias admired. There was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore, though she tried to hide it behind a smile whenever she spoke. It had only been a few days since they had arrived, but Elias could already tell that Beatrice was a woman who had been through a lot. "Thank you again for taking us in," Beatrice said softly, her voice carrying a weight of emotion. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper. "I didn't know where else we could go. I don't know what we would have done without your help." Elias nodded, a little uncomfortable with her thanks. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. In his solitude, he had become accustomed to doing everything on his own. But something about the way Beatrice spoke, the way her children looked at him as though he were their savior, stirred something within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "It's nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I couldn't leave you out there in the cold. It's the right thing to do." Beatrice smiled softly, but Elias could see that her eyes were tired. There was a heaviness in them that no amount of warmth or food could lift. She had lost so much, and Elias couldn't help but wonder how she had come to be in this situation, but he didn't ask. He wasn't one to pry into other people's pain. Instead, he focused on the present, watching as the children finished their meal and began to relax in the warmth of the fire. Over the next few days, the small cabin was filled with sounds Elias had long forgotten: laughter, chatter, and the soft hum of life. The children had settled in quickly, though it took some time for them to feel completely at ease in the Woodsman's home. Thomas, the eldest, had started helping Elias with small chores around the cabin, mostly gathering firewood and helping to repair the roof. Emily, full of energy, spent her time playing outside with the dogs Elias kept, while Lily, the youngest, stuck close to her mother, seeking comfort in her warmth. At night, Beatrice and Elias would sit by the fire, the warmth from the flames reflecting in their tired faces. Beatrice would tell him stories of her life before the fire, of the small house she had shared with her late husband and their plans for the future. But every time she spoke of the past, there was a sadness in her voice. and Elias could see that the memories were too painful to revisit. One evening, as the sun began to set and the light outside faded, Beatrice looked at Elias and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I know we've been a burden to you. I didn't mean to bring so much trouble." Elias looked at her, his face softening. He had never seen himself as someone who could be a burden. In fact, he found himself strangely enjoying the company of Beatrice and her children. He had always thought of himself as a solitary man, but there was something about the way the children's laughter filled the cabin, the way they eagerly awaited his return from the forest, that made him feel needed. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he missed. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're welcome here, and I'm glad to have you." Beatrice smiled, though it was a weary smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a depth of emotion that Elias couldn't fully understand. But he knew in that moment that something between them had shifted. They were no longer just a stranger and a kind soul offering shelter. They were something more, something that could become a family, if only in this small cabin in the woods. As the days passed, Elias began to notice small changes in himself. He started to look forward to the moments when the children would ask him questions about the forest, or when Emily would excitedly show him the animals she had found. He found himself taking extra care in preparing meals, making sure everyone had enough to eat. He found himself, without realizing it, caring about their well-being. He hadn't known how empty his life had been until the warmth of the children's presence had filled the cabin. One day, while Elias was out gathering firewood, Thomas approached him, carrying a bundle of twigs he had gathered on his own. The boy's eyes were full of determination. "I'm helping you, Elias," Thomas said with a smile. "I want to be strong, like you." Elias paused and looked at the boy. He was growing up fast, and there was something about his earnestness that reminded him of his younger self. In that moment, Elias realized that this boy, this family, had begun to fill a space in his heart he hadn't known existed. "You're doing a good job," Elias said, his voice softer than usual. "Keep it up, Thomas." The boy smiled proudly and ran back to the cabin. Elias watched him go, feeling a warmth inside him that had nothing to do with the fire. The days were passing, and the cold of winter was starting to set in. But inside the cabin, Elias no longer felt the emptiness he had once known. Beatrice and her children had brought light into his life, and with it came a feeling of connection that Elias had long forgotten. The lonely woodsman was no longer alone. As winter settled over the forest, Elias and his new family began to adjust to their unusual living arrangement. The days were cold and snow blanketed the ground, turning the world outside into a quiet, white landscape. Inside the cabin, however, the warmth of the fire and the presence of Beatrice and her children made the harsh weather outside seem distant. But with the cold came new challenges. Elias had always been prepared for the harsh winters of the forest. He had learned over the years how to gather enough firewood, hunt for food, and make sure his cabin was warm enough to survive the long season. But now there were more people to care for. Beatrice, though strong and determined, couldn't work as much as Elias. The children were young, and while they helped with small tasks, the heavy lifting and the hard work still fell on Elias's shoulders. The first snowfall had come early that year, and while Elias had gathered enough firewood to last for a few weeks, the supply was starting to run low. He knew that the next few weeks would be difficult. The forest would soon be covered in deep snow, making it harder to gather wood. He needed to prepare, and he needed help. One cold morning, Elias went outside to check on the firewood pile. It had shrunk much faster than he had expected. He sighed, rubbing his gloved hands together. It was still early in the season, and they had a long way to go before the snow would melt. Inside the cabin, Beatrice was busy making bread. She had learned quickly how to cook with what little they had. Though she missed her old life and the comfort of having more, she had adapted just as she always had. She had always been resourceful, and now more than ever, she was determined to make sure her children were well fed and warm. But as the days passed, the struggle to keep warm and well fed began to take its toll on everyone. The food supplies were running low. They had only a small amount of dried meat left, and the vegetables they had stored were almost gone. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they would need to hunt more. The forest was full of wildlife, but it wasn't always easy to catch game in the winter. One afternoon, Elias decided to venture deeper into the woods. He had to hunt if they were going to survive the coming weeks. He bundled up in his thickest coat, packed his rifle, and set off through the snow-covered trees, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. As Elias walked, he thought about how different his life had become in such a short time. Not long ago he had been alone, content with the quiet of the forest. But now, with Beatrice and her children, the world seemed to have more meaning. They had filled a space in his heart that he hadn't known was empty. But Elias also felt the weight of his new responsibilities. He was the one who had to provide for them. He was the one who had to keep them safe. It was a heavy burden to bear, especially with winter's harshness closing in. After several hours of walking, Elias found tracks in the snow, deer tracks. He followed them carefully, moving quietly through the trees. His heart raced with hope. If he could bring down a deer, it would provide food for them for days. He crept closer, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered ground, searching for signs of movement. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the trees ahead. Elias froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. He slowly raised it, taking careful aim, but just as he was about to pull the trigger, something stopped him. The rustling wasn't from a deer. It was from a small animal, a rabbit, hopping through the underbrush. Elias lowered his rifle, his heart still pounding from the sudden rush of excitement. He cursed softly under his breath, realizing that hunting in the deep snow was going to be much harder than he had thought. But he didn't give up. He spent the rest of the day tracking the deer, his boots sinking into the snow with each step. He knew he had to bring something back for Beatrice and the children. By the time the sun was setting, Elias was exhausted. His legs ached from the long walk and his stomach growled with hunger. He had seen no sign of deer, only rabbit tracks and the occasional squirrel. The hunt had been fruitless. As Elias trudged back toward the cabin, his mind began to worry. The food supply was dwindling fast, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could survive on what little they had left. The winter was just beginning, and it could last for months. He had to find a way to provide for them. But the longer the hunt went on without success, the more his doubts grew. When he arrived back at the cabin, Beatrice was waiting for him by the fire. She looked up as he entered, her face tired but kind. "Did you find anything?" she asked softly. Elias shook his head. "No, not yet. But I'll try again tomorrow." Beatrice nodded, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "We can't keep going on like this," she said quietly. "I know you're doing your best, Elias, but we need more food. The children are already getting weaker." Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hated seeing them struggle. He hated the helplessness that came with not being able to provide. He had always been the one to fix things, to make sure everything was right. But now it seemed like no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't do enough. "I'll find something," he said, his voice firm, though he wasn't sure how he would manage it. "I'll get us through this." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his bed, listening to the wind howl outside, the trees creaking in the cold. He could hear the soft sounds of Beatrice and the children moving in the next room. They were settling in for the night, trying to rest despite the worries that weighed on them all. The next morning, Elias set out again. He couldn't let them down. This time he knew he had to go farther into the forest. If he didn't find anything soon, they would run out of food. But as he trudged through the snow, something inside him began to change. The pressure was building, and the fear of failure was growing stronger. He had never felt so much responsibility before, and the burden was heavy. But as he walked, a thought crossed his mind. He wasn't alone anymore. Beatrice and her children weren't just guests in his cabin. They were his family now. And family meant fighting for each other. No matter how hard it was, no matter how cold the winter, Elias knew he would do whatever it took to protect them. Spring arrived slowly, gently. The heavy snow that had blanketed the forest for months began to melt, revealing patches of earth once hidden beneath the white. The air warmed and the days grew longer, casting more sunlight into the cabin. Inside, the fire was no longer needed to keep the chill at bay, though Elias still lit it on cool mornings. The world outside seemed to come back to life, and with it came new hope. For Beatrice and her children, the change in the season was like a breath of fresh air. The cold winter had been long and difficult, but now the sun seemed to give them new energy. The children were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. Emily, the lively girl of 10, spent her afternoons chasing the squirrels and rabbits that had returned to the woods. She laughed as she ran through the trees, her energy almost endless. Thomas, the eldest, now helped Elias more than ever. The boy had grown strong from the work he had done over the winter, cutting wood and helping Elias with various tasks around the cabin. He was becoming a young man, showing promise in everything he touched. Elias noticed how Thomas was learning more each day, not just about woodcutting but about life, about the responsibility of caring for others. And then there was Lily, the youngest. Her shyness had faded, and she now spent most of her time with her mother, helping Beatrice around the cabin. She had become attached to Elias's dogs, often playing with them outside, her laughter filling the air as she ran with them in the fresh grass. Beatrice, too, was beginning to find peace in the warmer days. The weight of the cold winter had lifted, and with the arrival of spring, she felt like she could breathe more easily. Her strength was returning, both physically and emotionally. She had learned to adapt to the hardships of winter, but the warmth of the sun now gave her hope. One morning, as Elias worked in the woods, he noticed something new about himself. He had never been a man who thought much about family, not after his wife's passing. His heart had been closed off to the idea of having anyone else in his life. But now, as he worked alongside Thomas, and as he saw Beatrice and the children so full of life, he realized how much had changed. He was no longer just a solitary woodsman. He had become a part of something bigger, something he hadn't even known he was missing. He had become a father figure to Thomas, a protector to Beatrice, and a friend to the children. When Elias returned to the cabin that evening, Beatrice was waiting for him by the fire, as she often did. She smiled at him as he entered, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Dinner is almost ready," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I hope you don't mind, but I found a few herbs and wild vegetables while I was outside. It will make the stew taste better." Elias smiled, though there was something more in his smile than just appreciation for the meal. It was something deeper, something that had been growing over the last few months. He had found a new sense of purpose. The cabin had become a home in a way he had never imagined it could be. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. His voice was steady but filled with meaning. Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "I'm glad too. We're lucky to have found you." Elias sat down by the fire, watching as the flames flickered and danced in the hearth. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had been alone, just a lonely woodsman. Now it felt like the cabin had its own heartbeat. It had become a place of warmth, of laughter, and of love. After dinner, the family gathered around the fire, the children sitting close to their mother, their faces bright and happy. Elias sat across from them, his thoughts drifting as the crackling of the fire filled the silence. "We've made it through the hardest part," Beatrice said, breaking the silence. "The winter was hard, but we're stronger for it." Elias nodded, agreeing with her words. The winter had tested them all, but they had made it. They had survived. "We still have a long way to go," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "But we're doing it together, and that's what matters." Beatrice smiled at him, her eyes full of warmth. "Yes, together." The next few days brought more changes. The snow continued to melt and the ground became soft and muddy. Elias, now that the worst of the cold was over, began to think about the future. He had grown fond of the family. More than just fond. He had come to care for them deeply. He had come to see them as his own, as much a part of his life as the forest itself. Elias spent time teaching Thomas the finer skills of woodworking, showing him how to carve, how to build furniture, how to measure and cut with precision. Thomas was a quick learner, and Elias was proud to see him growing into a capable young man. They worked side by side, and Elias began to think that, in some ways, Thomas was like the son he had never had. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and the sky turned orange, Thomas asked Elias a question. "Do you think we'll ever leave the forest?" Thomas asked, his voice full of curiosity. Elias looked at him, considering the question. He had never really thought about leaving. The forest was where he felt most at home. But now, with Beatrice and the children, he realized something. Maybe he wasn't meant to be alone anymore. Maybe this place, The cabin, the woods, and the people he had come to care for was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I don't know, Thomas," Elias said, his voice steady. "But I do know that right now, this is home, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." Thomas nodded, understanding. He smiled up at Elias, and in that moment Elias saw something in the boy's eyes, something that reminded him of himself when he was younger, before life had become so complicated. As the seasons changed, so too did the family. They had come together in a time of need, and now they were something more. They were a family, whether by blood or by circumstance didn't matter. They had found each other, and that was what mattered most. In the coming months, Elias continued to work alongside Thomas, while Beatrice cared for the children and maintained the cabin. The work was hard, but it was a labor of love. The days were full, and the nights were peaceful. The forest, once a place of solitude for Elias, had become a place of belonging. Elias often found himself sitting by the fire, watching the children play or listening to Beatrice talk about the future. He realized that the family he had never expected had become the family he had always needed. He had found a home, not in the forest alone, but with the people he cared about. As the months passed, the cabin in the woods became more than just a shelter. It became a home, filled with warmth, love, and the sounds of a family living together. Elias had never imagined that his quiet, solitary life would lead to something like this. He had once lived alone, wrapped in memories of his wife and the pain of loss. Now he had found a new purpose, a reason to live beyond just surviving. His days were filled with the laughter of children, the quiet strength of Beatrice, and the constant sense that he was no longer alone. Elias and Beatrice had become partners in every sense of the word. Though they had never formally spoken of it, there was an understanding between them, an unspoken promise. They shared the responsibility of raising the children, of caring for the cabin, and of facing whatever challenges life brought them. Beatrice had become his equal, her strength and kindness a steady force in their lives. Elias had never thought of himself as a father again, but as he watched Thomas grow stronger, more capable each day, he realized that he had become a father to him. The bond between them had deepened over the months. Thomas no longer saw Elias as just the man who had taken them in, but as someone he trusted, someone he looked up to. And Elias had come to see Thomas as a son, his pride in the boy growing with each passing day. The family's bond was further strengthened when Thomas and Elias spent their days working together, building furniture, repairing the cabin, and learning more about the ways of the forest. It wasn't just about work. It was about connection. Elias had once thought that the forest was his only companion, but now, with Thomas by his side, he saw the world differently. The forest was still a friend, but it was no longer his only one. Beatrice, too, had grown stronger in the time they had spent together. She had learned to balance the demands of caring for her children with the realities of life in the woods. Though the work was hard and the days sometimes long, she had found a peace in the routine of it all. She knew that her children were safe and loved, and that meant everything to her. Elias had shown her that there was more to life than just surviving. There was also living, truly living, and with Elias by her side, she had begun to dream again. Lily, now 7, had become a bright, energetic girl who filled the cabin with joy. Her laughter was contagious, and her bond with Elias had deepened as she spent more time with him and the animals. She had come to see him as a protector, someone who would always take care of her and her family. Emily, too, had blossomed, growing into a spirited young girl who loved exploring the forest and learning about the animals that lived there. The cabin had transformed from a lonely, cold place into a home where memories were made every day. The walls of the small cabin had witnessed so much: the laughter of children, the soft words shared by Elias and Beatrice, and the quiet moments of shared understanding. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, but in the best way. One afternoon, as the family gathered around the fire, Beatrice looked at Elias with a smile on her face. The children were playing nearby, their voices filled with joy. Elias sat quietly watching the scene, his thoughts drifting. He hadn't realized how much he had come to care for them, how much they had become a part of his life. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Beatrice said softly, her voice full of quiet emotion. Elias nodded, his heart full. "Yes, we have. It doesn't feel like it's been that long." Beatrice smiled, her eyes warm. "When I first came here, I didn't know what would happen. I thought we might never find a place to call home again, but you gave us that. Elias looked at her, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. He had never expected to find another family, to find someone who would help him heal from the past. But now, as he looked around at the life they had built together, he knew that he had found something far more precious than he had ever hoped for. We did it together, Elias said quietly. You and the children, you brought life back to this place. You gave me something I never thought I'd have again. Beatrice reached out, taking his hand in hers. And you gave us a home, a place where we could be safe and loved. I can never thank you enough for that. Elias smiled, squeezing her hand gently. There's no need to thank me. We're a family now. The word family had always felt distant to Elias, something that belonged to others, not to him. But now, as he sat there with Beatrice, Thomas, Emily, and Lily, he understood what it meant. They weren't just people who had come together by chance. They were a family bound by love, trust, and a shared journey. They had each other, and that was enough. As the days passed, life continued to improve. The cabin became more comfortable, and Elias's skills as a woodsman allowed him to provide for his family. The children grew, each day bringing new moments of discovery and growth. Elias found himself sharing more with them, teaching them about the forest, about the world outside the cabin, about life itself. And with each lesson, he realized that he had become a part of something far greater than himself. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned dark, the family gathered for dinner. They sat together, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the candlelight, sharing stories and laughter. Elias watched them, his heart full. He had found his place not just in the forest, but in this family. Beatrice looked around at her children and then at Elias. We've made a new life here, she said softly. And I know that we're going to be okay. We have each other. Elias smiled, his heart at peace. Yes, we do. The days of loneliness, the days of pain, seemed so far away now. Elias had found something that mattered more than the quiet of the forest. He had found a family that would stay with him forever. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people he loved, he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. In the heart of the forest, in the small cabin that had once been so empty, Elias had found a new beginning. It wasn't the life he had expected, but it was the life he had always needed.